The restaurant is quiet for a Tuesday. Corner booth, good lighting. The kind of place a man takes someone when he still believes in occasions. He's 63, gray at the temples, jacket that still fits well because he hasn't let himself go. Not completely. He ordered the salmon. She ordered the salad. They've been doing this monthly dinner thing since the divorce was finalized. Co-parenting, technically. The kids are grown. But habits outlive their reasons. She's talking about something, a trip she took, someone she met there. Her voice has a lightness he doesn't recognize. Or maybe he does recognize it, and that's the problem. He reaches for his water glass. His hand is steady, his jaw is not. Across the table, she laughs at something she said. Not for him, just laughs. The way people laugh when they've stopped calculating your reaction. He sets the glass down, looks at the condensation ring on the white linen.
The waiter passes behind her.
A couple at the next table glances over, not dramatically, just the way people notice things in quiet restaurants. He says nothing for 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a long time when you're measuring the distance between who you thought you were and who the mirror says you've become. Finally, he says, "That sounds nice." And she nods, already moving to the next thing. Later, in the parking lot, sitting in the car before starting the engine, he doesn't cry. He doesn't rage. He stares at the steering wheel and feels something he hasn't been able to name for 2 years. Most men will tell you the worst part of divorce after 60 is the loneliness. They're wrong. The worst part is the disorientation, the sudden unsettling suspicion that the life you built, the role you played, the identity you maintained, may have been a performance you gave for an audience that has now left the theater. And what no one tells you, what almost no man at this age is willing to say out loud, is this: some men walk out of that parking lot and slowly disappear. And some men walk out and, over the next 2, 3, 4 years, become the most grounded, most alive version of themselves they've ever been. The difference between those two men has almost nothing to do with the divorce itself. There's something most men miss entirely in that moment. Let's go beneath the surface. Because what happens in that parking lot, what happens in the months that follow, it isn't really about the marriage ending. It's about what the marriage was quietly doing for a man that he never had to consciously acknowledge. For most men in this generation, men who came up in the 1960s and 70s, who built careers and households and identities around a specific kind of structure, marriage wasn't just a relationship. It was infrastructure. It was the container that organized his sense of purpose, his daily rhythm, his social identity, and quietly, his self-worth. He knew who he was because of where he came home to. That's not a criticism. It's a developmental reality for an entire generation of men who were never taught to distinguish between what they do and who they are. So when the structure dissolves, whether through divorce or widowhood or a marriage that simply hollowed itself out over 2 decades, what collapses isn't just the relationship. What collapses is the architecture of the self. And here's where the psychology gets precise. Men who deteriorate after divorce at this age tend to share one invisible characteristic. They locate their authority externally. Their status came from the role: husband, provider, head of household, father actively in the home. Remove the role, and the authority evaporates with it. They feel it before they can articulate it. That sudden sense of being somehow illegitimate, like a general without an army. Impressive credentials, nowhere to command. What follows that feeling is predictable, though it takes different forms. Some men pursue replacement urgently. A new relationship, sometimes too quickly, seeking not love exactly, but the restoration of familiar structure. The role reassigned rather than reconsidered. Others retreat. They simplify their world until it matches their diminished sense of self. Smaller apartment, fewer friends, less engagement. A quiet, dignified contraction they tell themselves is peace, but is actually surrender. And a smaller number, the ones who glow up, as the younger generation puts it, do something that requires a particular kind of intellectual courage. They get uncomfortable with themselves on purpose. They stop outsourcing their sense of self to any structure, any role, any other person's narrative about who they are. And they begin, often clumsily at first, building an identity that doesn't require anyone else's confirmation to stand upright. This isn't a motivational concept. It's a cognitive restructuring. It's the difference between a man whose self-respect is backed by gold, something intrinsic, and a man whose self-respect is backed by paper, printed by circumstances, dependent on conditions remaining favorable. The collapse happens when the conditions change. The glow-up happens when a man realizes, sometimes for the first time at 63 years old, that he was always the mint. He was always the source. He just never had to test that because the external structure was always there to do the job. Now, let's apply some rigor. Because this idea that a man can simply decide to rebuild himself from the inside out after a major life rupture can itself become a kind of myth. A flattering story men tell themselves that delays rather than advances actual recovery. The truth is more nuanced. Not every man who struggles after divorce is struggling because of psychological dependency. Some men collapse because they are genuinely, legitimately grieving. A 30-year marriage that ends, even one that had to end, carries a real weight of loss. Children grown in that house. A woman you knew before either of you were finished people. The accumulation of ordinary moments that, in retrospect, form the texture of an entire life. To pathologize that grief, to tell a man that his pain is merely ego, merely structural dependency, is both clinically wrong and humanly insulting. Grief is not weakness. Grief is the price of having loved something real. The distinction that matters, and it's a distinction that requires patience to observe in yourself, is whether the pain is moving or static. Moving pain changes shape. It has texture. It arrives in waves, loosens its grip, returns differently. Men experiencing genuine grief tend to be able to function in between the waves. They still make decisions. They still notice the world around them. Static pain is different. It has a gravitational quality. It doesn't evolve. It simply reestablishes itself each morning at the same altitude. Men in static pain tend to organize their identity around the wound. The divorce becomes the central narrative of who they are. Every conversation curves back toward it. Every new experience gets filtered through it. That distinction, moving versus static, is more useful than any framework of strength or weakness. There's also a second failure mode worth naming, the performance of reinvention. Some men over 60, after a divorce, launch into a kind of theatrical self-transformation. New wardrobe, gym obsession, dating profiles that look like a version of themselves from 15 years ago. They perform glow up without doing the underlying work, which means the new surface is applied over the same unexamined foundation. This isn't transformation, it's renovation without structural inspection. The renovation can look compelling for a while.
But the foundation hasn't changed, which means the same patterns, the same tendencies, the same blind spots, the same emotional habits that contributed to the marriage's deterioration quietly reassert themselves in the new context.
The men who genuinely elevate after this kind of rupture are usually not the ones who look transformed first. They're the ones who were willing to be confused for a while, who let the disorientation do its work rather than immediately resolving it with action. Sitting in the discomfort is not the same as drowning in it. That's the line. So what does it actually look like, practically, behaviorally, when a man navigates this well? It doesn't look dramatic. That's the first thing to understand. The men who come through this period with their character intact and their inner life expanded tend to share a set of habits, not personality traits, not natural gifts, but chosen disciplines that don't require inspiration to maintain. The first is ruthless social honesty, not vulnerability in the performative sense, not announcing your pain to anyone who will listen, but a genuine, private willingness to stop curating your presentation with the people who actually matter to you, your adult children, an old friend who has known you for decades, a sibling, whoever is in your inner ring. Men in this generation were trained to perform steadiness, to project composure under pressure. That skill served them well in professional and family contexts. It becomes a liability in personal reconstruction because it prevents the kind of honest feedback that recalibrates you. If the people who know you best are always receiving a managed version of you, they can only offer managed responses. which means you spend years navigating with a compass calibrated to a version of yourself that no longer exists. The second discipline is structured solitude, not isolation. That's a different animal entirely. Structured solitude means deliberately creating conditions where you are alone with no task, no distraction, no productivity to hide behind, and just noticing what rises. This is uncomfortable for men who have spent decades in constant forward motion. Purpose, output, execution. Silence without an agenda feels like waste. But it's in that specific discomfort, the itch of unstructured time, that a man begins to discover what he actually values versus what he was conditioned to value. Some men discover they genuinely miss the work, the building, the solving. They want to stay active and engaged. That's good information. Others discover that what they called ambition was actually anxiety wearing a productive mask, and that beneath it, they have appetites for things they've been deferring since their 30s, a skill they never developed, a place they never traveled to, a creative impulse they kept filing away for later. Later has arrived. The third discipline, and this one requires some courage, is selective re-entry, not throwing yourself back into the social world indiscriminately, not dating immediately out of loneliness, but choosing deliberately and slowly which contexts you want to occupy, what kind of men you want to be around, what kind of conversations you're willing to sustain, and which ones drain you now in ways they never did before. Your tolerance for performance drops at 60. For most men, that's experienced as social withdrawal. They just see fewer people, engage less broadly. But the sharper interpretation is that your signal-to-noise sensitivity has increased. You have less patience for relationships that require you to be smaller or louder than you actually are. That's not deterioration, that's refinement. The men who isolate after divorce conflate that refinement with rejection. They feel the world contracting when it's actually their preferences clarifying. The men who glow up understand the distinction and act accordingly. They invest deeply in fewer relationships. They spend their social energy more precisely. They become, paradoxically, more genuinely connected by engaging less broadly. There's a version of this conversation that would end with a rallying cry, something about men being forged in difficulty, about fire making gold, about the best chapter being the one unwritten. That version would be dishonest. Because what actually happens when a man does this work, when he sits in the disorientation long enough to learn from it, isn't triumphant in any cinematic sense. It's quieter than that and more durable. What gets left behind is the need for consensus, not healthy interdependence, not the desire for real connection, but the specific, invisible hunger for external validation of his worth. The need to be seen as successful by people who wouldn't know the difference between his life and their projection of it. That falls away. And without it, a man's energy, the actual daily allocation of his attention and effort, changes significantly. He stops spending himself on things that were never really his, obligations that were inherited rather than chosen, relationships maintained out of inertia, self-images imported wholesale from someone else's expectation. What gets built in the space that opens up is harder to name. Call it interiority. Call it groundedness. Call it the particular calm of a man who no longer needs the room to change when he walks into it. He still has preferences. He still has standards. He still engages fully in things that deserve his full engagement. But there is no longer an audience in his head that he's performing for. No internal committee weighing his decisions against some imagined benchmark of how men like him are supposed to live. He becomes, in a specific sense, less legible to people who only understand men through social performance. He doesn't fit the expected categories, not bitter, not desperately reinventing, not grinding, not fading. He simply is, deliberately, specifically, without apology or announcement, himself. That quality, that particular self-possession, is what people in his orbit eventually begin to register. Not as charisma in the theatrical sense, but as gravity, the quality of someone who does not need you to complete him and is therefore genuinely free to want you, to choose you, to invest in you from abundance rather than deficit. Legacy, for a man who has done this work, stops being about monuments and starts being about transmission. What he passes forward isn't a financial structure or a family name. It's a way of being in difficulty, a model for how a man holds himself when the structure falls away and only character remains. His children notice, not because he announces it, but because presence is detectable and its absence always was. That man in the parking lot, the one sitting with both hands on the steering wheel, staring at the dashboard, he has a choice in that moment that he may not even recognize as a choice. He can decide that what just happened to him is the story, the central organizing narrative of the years that followed, the divorce, the loss, the identity that dissolved. Or he can decide that what just happened to him is the condition, not the story, the starting point. The men who collapse after 60 do not collapse because they are weak. They collapse because they were never asked to locate themselves outside the structure. And when the structure disappeared, they couldn't find themselves without it. The men who glow up, and some of them do, quietly, without fanfare, in ways that won't make headlines or go viral, those men found something in that parking lot that had always been there. Not strength, something more precise than strength, clarity, about what they actually value, about who they actually are when no role is asking them to be otherwise, about how much of what they called their life was built by them, and how much was simply lived through them by circumstance. The question worth sitting with, genuinely sitting with, not answering immediately, is this. If everything that confirmed your identity was stripped away tomorrow, what would remain? Not what should remain, not what you'd want to remain. What would actually still be standing? The man who can answer that question, slowly, honestly, without flinching, is not the man divorce breaks. He's the man it finishes making.